Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Unpacking Europe, the Centre for European Reform's podcast. My name is Thomas Maddock, and I'm the CER's Clara Marina O'Donnell Fellow for 2025 to 2026. And in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at one of the EU's most crucial relationships, and one that has been getting particular interest in recent months, the EU's relationship with Turkey. In February, the EU's Enlargement Commissioner, Maddock, traveled to Ankara to meet with various Turkish officials, including the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. The meetings explored the various opportunities for a deeper relationship, economic ties and modernizing the customs union, as well as security and regional matters. After all, both the EU and Türkiye face differing threats from Russia. But in several areas, the relationship remains held back by mutual lack of trust. Key sticking points in the relationship currently include that a political solution to the Cyprus question remains elusive. There have been maritime disputes over the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey's stalled EU accession process remains a sore spot. Turkey remains a candidate country for EU membership. Talks have been effectively on ice since 2018. Democratic backsliding and the targeting of political opponents in Turkey have also raised questions about the direction of the political system. What about foreign policy? Though both Turkey and most EU member states are members of NATO, both sides have diverged significantly on some questions. Ankara has sought to engage Moscow, triggering a backlash in some EU capitals, even if Turkey's support to Ukraine has been crucial. There have been some perceived double standards in the EU's Israel-Palestine policy that have also been a source of contention. And I should also mention the political sensitivity of migration and refugee flows in all of this. All these issues and more have undermined trust in the relationship, and this raises several questions. Can the EU and Turkey break this political impasse? Is there political will to build a more productive relationship? Can the EU and Turkey move from a more transactional relationship to a more cooperative one? Here to address these questions and more, I am delighted to welcome our two experts for today's episode. First, I would like to welcome Professor Senem Aydin-Düzgit, Director of the Istanbul Policy Center. Second, I would like to welcome Galip Dalay, the Senior Consulting Fellow for the Turkey Initiative in the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Welcome to you both. Galip, I'd like to come to you first. So let's start with the recent visit of Maddock. Some observers have remarked that this might be a potentially significant moment for EU-Türkiye relations. From your perspective, how should we interpret this visit? What broader dynamics might be driving any renewed engagement between Brussels and Ankara?
Well, thank you very much. There is a growing recognition and consciousness at the EU and European level that the relation with Turkey is crucial at a time when the geopolitics and security is defining the future of European project as a whole. And that is very much bringing the Turkey issue at the center of many discussions. But we have to make a distinction. What is changing, what is improving in Turkey-EU relations is not Turkey's relation with the EU as an institutional framework or the EU body. It is improvement in Turkey's relation with the individual European states. So the center of gravity in Turkey-European relation has long moved from Brussels to the capital cities, like to Berlin, to Paris, to Rome, so that today it is more about the bilateral relation with the individual European states rather than it's being about Brussels. Second, obviously, security and geopolitics is a driver since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The importance of Turkey-European relation has gained added momentum. And here we have to bear in mind, it's not the hope factor. It is usually the fear factor that usually brings Europe and Turkey closer, particularly from the European perspective, I would say. When the Europe is fearful about the future, not hopeful about the future, it is when the Europe that is trying to explore new form of relationship with Turkey. And this is quite crucial. So the fearful rather than the hopeful factor being the main driver of that. And today's Europe is fearful about the future. It's fearful about its own future. It's fearful about the future of its neighborhood. Is fearful about the global disorder or the global restructuring that is taking place. When Turkey or many other middle power countries sees the question of multipolarity more through the positive lenses, the Europeans or the Westerns and the Europeans in general sees the same question through more negative lenses. Because multipolarity for many in the non-Western world, including for even countries like Turkey, means the existence of the multiple choices for actors in Europe. That means the rise of the West. That means the world that they knew for long is no longer exist, at least not in the same shape. that means that, it's a world in which there are different centers of power. So therefore, all this geopolitical, global restructuring, the wars from Ukraine to Iran, from Gaza to the changing geopolitics of the Syria, Lebanon, create more and more momentum, more and more consciousness for the Europe that they need to have better relation with Turkey. But I think the fundamental issue that remains is the following, at least on geopolitical matters. A, whether the both sides will be partner or rival in their shared neighborhood. This is quite crucial. B, whether they have a similar reading of the global restructuring. Because it's not only the Russia question, now you have also the US question that is very much changing the dynamics, individual capitals. C, how the Turkey will feature in this supply chain question for Europe, in these connectivity projects with Europe, because that will also tell us to what extent Turkish economy will remain anchored within the European economy. So all these factors will fundamentally reshape the nature and the future of Turkey-European relationship. But I will start with the neighborhood, because for a long time, the idea was that Europe will change its neighborhood. But today, it's a neighborhood that changes Europe. And probably Europe, at a time when it talks about the geopolitics, it talks about security, it puts more money into the defense industry, probably is also at a time when the Europe geopolitically is experiencing the most insignificant periods for decades. Put aside Ukraine, where the Europe is significant there, so we have to recognize this. Today's European reading of the geopolitics is extremely skewed, but the whole European neighborhood is collapsing. Europe today, unfortunately, doesn't bring much to the table in Iran, neither geopolitically nor security-wise, nor normatively or from the moral questions. The fact that Europe could not even address the illegal nature of the war. So therefore, the Europe is fearful about the future, and I think this fear factor is the most important factor that is driving Europe to look for alternative for closer cooperation with Turkey. But the center of gravity in this relationship has moved from Brussels to the individual capital cities.
Thank you, Galip. I think you touch on a really important point that EU foreign policy is not just dictated by Brussels, but very much by the national capitals and the bilateral disputes that exist between individual countries and Türkiye. I'd like to come to you, Senem, on this actually. When looking at EU-Türkiye relations today, how do you see the political dynamics on both sides, these bilateral disputes shaping the relationship? What do you see as the main political obstacles right now to a more constructive relationship between the EU and Türkiye?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for having me on the podcast. Now, if we're going to talk about political dynamics, I think we have to acknowledge that there are both push and pull factors that draw the EU and Turkey together, but also that sets them apart on many major counts. On the one hand, if you look at it from a European perspective, we have a union that seeks to expand its trade agreements, boost its industrial capacity, and Turkey emerges as a potentially important partner in those fields. Again, if you look at security and defense, Turkey, of course, is the second largest force in NATO, a major defense producer, an active contributor to NATO missions and operations and all of these. And all of the major geopolitical conflicts that Europe is in fact exposed to directly or indirectly, take it from Russia, Ukraine, but also, the ones in the southern neighborhood, like the one that we're going through with Iran and the wider Middle East, all of these are in fact located in Turkey's wider neighborhood, where Turkey has a significant geopolitical presence. Plus, you have other individual policy areas that are connected to these, like migration or climate, etc. These also necessitate a closer dialogue between Turkey and the European Union. And same goes for Turkey. We might, talk a bit more about this later on, but EU, of course, is Turkey's largest trading partner. It's, EU member states are the major providers of FDI in Turkey. All these trade deals that EU is signing with the rest of the world, it's having a major impact. It will have a major impact on Turkey. And on the other hand, in addition to all of these, there are bilateral relations, as Galip was saying, between more closely with certain EU member states and others, also covering cooperation in defense industries as well. Now, these are the factors that are kind of, pulling these two sides together. Now, on the other hand, you have other political dynamics, which are proving to be important hindrances. Now, of course, we have to mention the state of democracy, human rights, rule of law in Turkey, that creates an important bottleneck. Another one is the mistrust across the EU towards Turkey, but not just mistrust in the EU, but also mistrust in Turkey towards the European Union as well. So there's, I would say, mutual distrust between the two sides. And part of it, of course, has to do with what Galip said about Turkey becoming, more autonomous, or at least more or less autonomous middle power that aligns less and less with CFSP foreign policy decisions of the European Union, right? And because the days when there was very high degrees of alignment, let's say 15, 20 years ago, those were a different time geopolitically and also really regarding the state of the international order. And we're looking at a very different neighborhood, very different transatlantic relationship, a very different West, and the terms of the debates have completely changed. And Turkish foreign policy has also changed, as well as its domestic politics during this period. And of course, that creates alignment or trust quite difficult to build. Of course, the big sort of veto blocking point is the Cyprus issue, right? And the presence of Cyprus and Greece as full member states in the EU. And, they block key discussions on industrial policies. And these are all very crucial political, I would say, push factors on both sides that make it very difficult for a constructive engagement to be built and to continue. But there is increasing necessity to do so because of the reasons that I outlined earlier.
Thank you, Senem. I think both of you have really drawn attention to a key question right now, which is about the rising conflict between the US and Israel on one side and Iran, this dramatically escalating situation. And Senem, I'd like to really focus on this. Previously, we've seen how in moments of crisis, Europeans can struggle to articulate a common response on this. And the conflicts have really exposed the level of divisions within Europe. In light of this, how do you see the crisis reshaping the EU's approach to the Middle East? And in particular, is it pushing Brussels to rethink its approach towards Ankara?
Well, to be honest, I'm not very optimistic about a single European approach emerging towards the Middle East. I think Europe is very divided and split, especially on their attitudes on how their policies should be regarding the Trump administration and the United States, which, of course, the conflict in the Middle East is very closely related with. And I think this also ties into not just this particular conflict, but a wider phenomena, which is that, as much as the EU wishes to become a single, unified, assertive geopolitical actor, I think it lacks the unity and the instruments to be one beyond perhaps the more immediate conflict in Russia-Ukraine, as Galip was saying, which is very central to the European security narrative. So if we focus on the southern neighborhood, I don't see the EU emerging as a major player in that field in the near-time future. Despite all the talk and the rhetoric, there is awareness in Europe about this as well. And I think that reflects in how they approach Turkey too. Because if you look at, for instance, how von der Leyen reached out to Erdogan after the conflict with Iran broke out, the one thing that she emphasized in her message was cooperation on migration. So apparently their approach to the conflict in the Middle East is more of a defensive nature rather than taking a proactive attitude. As I said, they are limited by their means and instruments and political will to do so anyway. This connects to what Galip was saying about fear. And I would like to amplify that a little bit, actually. And I think it's not just any fear, but existential fear. So unless there is some kind of an existential threat, which the EU perceives to its own European order, and by that I mean, of course, mostly the national domestic orders of the EU member states, then it becomes very difficult for them to really have a deeper, profound discussion about relations with Turkey and where it should take. And migration is one of those existential fears that does unsettle the domestic orders of many, many European member states, most of them perhaps, if not all. And thus, when you have this conflict, this is the first point of line or entry into their conversation with Turkey. And I think that tells you something.
Thank you, Senem, for shining a light on the EU's defensive attitude and existential fear in how that develops its foreign policy making. Galip, I'd like to take a look at the Turkish side. For Ankara, how does this escalating conflict reshape Turkey's regional strategy and calculations? And how do you see Ankara balancing its interests with a more volatile US right now?
Well, one of the interesting things is who is the actors. There's a growing number of the actors that are creating more instability, that are sowing more seeds of the wars, conflicts. The question is, who is geopolitical firefighter? Who is playing the role of mediators? Who is playing the role of the peacemakers? And today, traditionally, there used to be many European actors, countries, or the multilateral institution that used to play this role. Today, it is the non-Western actors. I mean, obviously the place of Turkey is unique, both within Europe and also is within the non-Europe at the same time. So the Turkey is being one of the primary actors. These actors are playing more and more the role of the geopolitical firefighter, the fire that is being instigated, that is being created by actors like Israel, like United States, and unfortunately a fire that is being also aggravated by quite a few at the European level. At least you don't see as much opposition to those fires in Europe as one would expect to this. Decades ago, we used to hear quite imaginative, quite creative initiatives coming from Europe in terms of how to deal with its neighborhood, how to be part of its neighborhood, and how to chart a future between Europe and its neighborhood, be it the Barcelona process, be it the Europe-Mediterranean project. So there were like many creative initiatives that were trying to transform the neighborhood. But today, Europe is being changed and transformed by the neighborhood. And the Europe is adopting a very narrow perspective towards its neighborhood, which is the migration, the radicalism. In Iran, the question that is on European mind is not like what will be the best way of solving the war in Iran, is basically how to prevent another wave of the refugees coming to Europe. So the lens is very narrow. When the lens is narrow, the things that the Europe can bring to the table is very limited. In today's geopolitical fires across the region, the Europe brings very little to the table, unfortunately. It neither brings normative framework to the table because most of the European actors doesn't seem to have much respect for the international law, international humanitarian law when it comes to these wars, when it comes to these massacres, when it comes to these catastrophes. And secondly, it doesn't seem to be Europe as in a concerted manner plays much more of a diplomatic role. Like, let's not forget the EU, the nuclear deal was the European diplomacy's signature achievement. So it was the EU3 that actually started this nuclear diplomacy. So it was a signature achievement of the European diplomacy. And today, when there is a war, the Europe diplomatically, geopolitically, normatively is nowhere to be seen. When it comes to Turkey, obviously, when you look at the Turkish neighborhood, it is one of the very few stable places in a neighborhood that is on fire. I mean, look at Turkey's neighborhood. In the east, there's Iran war. In the north, there's Ukraine war. In the south, until recently, there was, in the south, there's Gaza war and Israel's regional revisionism and aggression towards many countries in the region, be it Lebanon, be it Syria, etc. So there is a fire that is almost like on all this neighborhood. And there, the first role that Turkey seems to try to play is one of the mediation, facilitation, or some sort of a peacemaking. We saw this, the role that it tried to play in within the context of Ukraine. Now we saw that Turkey is trying to activate the diplomatic front on Iran, and similarly in Syria during the transition, during the post-Assad transition, the Turkey is playing quite an important role. It's one of the major actors. The second one, I would say, the Turkey is naturally one of the center of gravity. I mean, if you're in South Caucasus, obviously, at the time when both Russia and Iran losing the ground in South Caucasus, it is a Turkey that is increasing in ground, and it is a Turkey that is forming the different form of relationship. I mean, not only with Azerbaijan and Georgia, right now, one of the most interesting and positive developments that is taking place is between Turkey and Armenia. And hopefully, probably, we will witness the full diplomatic restoration between the both countries and normalization between the both countries soon or in the upcoming period. And that would be quite a positive development. And similarly, you see when there is the war is or the insurgency, different type, is defining the geopolitical picture in Turkey, the Kurdish peace process has been one of the Turkey's major advantage points, because now we are talking whether the Iranian Kurds will engage in some sort of insurgency in Iran. In Syria, the Kurdish integration into central government has been thus far is going quite positively. We have seen the recent appointments. So therefore, this domestic Kurdish peace process has been another important factor in Turkey managing its neighborhood much more effectively. But I think at a broader level, given the nature of the threat, because for a long time now the Turkey perceives Israel as a direct security and geopolitical threat. And this is quite unusual, because up until recently, or up until the October 7th, or even the overthrow of the Assad regime, the Turkey did not perceive Israel as a direct security and geopolitical threat. It looked at Israel through a very Palestine perspective. So it was through a humanitarian and identity perspective. But now, particularly starting with the Israeli policy of revisionism in Syria, but now also the Israel's aggression on Iran, the war on Iran, all of them is creating a sense in Turkey which increasingly sees Israel as a direct geopolitical threat. But the other threat that Turkey has to navigate or face is the potential collapse of the Iranian state, or the Iran, in order to regionalize the war, becoming a factor and playing the factor of destabilizer across the region. So in a sense, you have the two potential strategic destabilizer across the region that is going to be shaping the Turkish geopolitical thinking and Turkey's relation with international actors quite significantly.
Thank you, Galip, for noting Ankara's perspective on this as kind of a mediator in a way. So I think both of you have painted quite a concerning picture of how things currently stand. And I'd like to perhaps explore what areas of cooperation might look like, suggest a few areas to cooperate. I'd like to start off with security and defense, which is already something that we've discussed. Security has returned to the center of the EU's agenda. We see now with the SAFE instrument, which you mentioned previously, unlocking 150 billion euros in investments in the EU defense industry. We see renewed partnerships with other countries, whether that's Ukraine, Canada, Japan, or even the United Kingdom. And over the past decade, there's been conversations about what role Turkey might play in European security. But these initiatives, Turkey does not seem to be taking a very central position currently. So Senem, I'd like to come to you specifically on this. What is blocking agreement here? What is blocking a deeper cooperation between the EU and Turkey on this? Do you see any areas where Turkey might be able to plug into European security initiatives?
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, if we're going to be discussing SAFE, SAFE is an instrument that is, yes, in principle open to candidates, but this inviting candidates or having candidates take part in the SAFE initiative is conditional, and it is politically mediated, which of course involves then politicization into the issue. Now, this is, of course, a major hindrance, because as long as you have Cyprus and Greece, and as long as you have their positions hijacking the rest of the European Union, and now I think the EU, many of the member states are in a position to adopt, or at least to be closer to the Cypriot and Greek position because of various reasons that we've discussed earlier, this makes it more likely. However, I think we should also mention that there are certain repercussions of excluding Turkey from SAFE. I mean, one, of course, excluding Turkey from SAFE means that there is ultimately going to be a mismatch between the European threat map and its institutional map. So basically the institutional map that EU is now creating with these instruments, and this is not just in the case of SAFE, this is also the case for its industrial policy and recent industrial policy initiatives as well. That as long as these two maps do not align, I think there is a problem with for Europe as well, because it risks further fragmentation. And of course, it also weakens this already awkward divide between NATO-centered defense and EU-centered defense initiatives, again, risking further fragmentation. And of course, it sort of diminishes the chance of a broader European ecosystem for defense rearmament. And I think this is an important issue. But on the other hand, having said all this, if you, of course, look at it from a European perspective or an EU perspective, they would tell you that, This is about trust, it's about misalignment, it's about political values, it's about the Cypriot and Greek veto, etc., democratic backsliding, foreign policy divergence, and all this and that. But from a Turkish perspective, I think, I'm not sure if Galip would agree with me, for Turkey, not being included in SAFE is not such a huge dramatic scenario for the time being. Perhaps I might not say the same for other industrial initiatives, but for this particular one, because of two reasons. First of all, Turkey already has close bilateral relationships and cooperation between Turkish defense companies and European defense companies, expanding now. Of course, there's a major one with Italy's Leonardo, for instance, but there are others as well, as far as I know, in Spain and elsewhere. But also, I think, perhaps even more, so they probably think that bilaterally speaking, they might be able to still make use of SAFE funds through the back door, through these bilateral arrangements or agreements or mergers with other European companies. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, I think the European security and defense initiatives so far, they seem to be falling very short of challenging NATO supremacy. So even if you take like the possibility of an EU security and defense initiative, deploying troops somewhere that matters, it looks like they won't be able to do that, even if they start today. Without a US plug-in or NATO plug-in, it doesn't look like they'll be able to build that capacity in at least a decade. And that is a pretty long time, and that's assuming that all goes well. In my opinion, Turkey is aware of this as well, and that connects to our earlier argument in the first round about EU being a geopolitical actor and how independent can it be from NATO? And even if it has the political will to do so, will it be able to overcome the big problem of fragmentation that really has undermined a collective European defense industrial capacity for so many years? But I think from a Turkish perspective, sort of these facts also figure into the discussions too.
Thank you, Senem. Galip, just from Ankara's perspective, is this bilateral perspective that Senem is talking about, the bilateral cooperation, is that seen as the more promising line for defense and security cooperation, or is Ankara perhaps seeking something more?
The question is, I think, quite simple. I mean, we are talking about the European security, not the EU security. How best is the European security can be achieved at a time when Russia is decidedly and clearly in the adversary camp for Europe, and at a time when US commitment to European security at best is uncertain, at worst, US is actively undermining the European security. Then how Europe can ensure its security in the best way? And I think here the answer is quite clear. Europe has to rethink about the European security with an open mind, or with a broader meaning of the term. And that means to look at it from European, not EU perspective. And that means to bringing on board the EU and non-EU NATO members together, which means the UK, Turkey, Norway, and then the EU member states, the major European actors, having a joint understanding of European security and engaging in structural cooperation on the subject. The structural cooperation will range from defense industry to the geopolitical matters, to the question of the neighborhood, to the question of how best European security can be achieved at a time when the sphere of influence geopolitics is being fashioned by the major powers, the US, China, and Russia, and when the wars and conflicts is becoming more and more the new normal. And in this respect, the Turkey, one thing that I think we should be crystal clear, the Turkey will not feel obligation to abide by the norms, the rules, or decision at the EU level if it's not in the room or if it's not part of the conversation. And therefore, this, from the defense industry to all these new European security initiatives, I think the fundamental way will be how best to bring Turkey, UK, Norway, and European actors, probably down the road also Ukraine, in the same room in a structural manner to have a much more significant conversation about European security, how to increase the elite level engagement on this one, and also how to create more cooperation between their defense industries, given that Turkey has also a fast expanding defense industry. And the decision or the action there will also to tell us to what extent the actors are approaching these questions from in a good faith manner, and to what extent they will actually cooperate with each other. So therefore, maybe individually A or this B initiative in itself cannot be a game changer when it comes to the perception in Ankara. But I think the more important thing that probably Ankara would be looking at the intention behind this dynamic of exclusion. If it feels that Europe is engaging in a very selective manner, so cooperate with Ankara where the Ankara has muscles in a sense, but exclude Ankara where it has something to offer to the Ankara, then I think that will also very much shape the Turkish perception of how to approach cooperation with Europe.
Thank you both for the conversation about that. I'd like to move on to the second area of cooperation, which is around economics. Turkish EU economic ties are arguably one of the more developed areas of the relationship. The customs union dates back to the mid-1990s, but it has limited sectoral coverage and represents a smaller share of EU-Turkish trade. And we've seen recent calls from the Turkish business community to modernize the trading terms. Senem, I'd like to come to you first on this. How do you assess the political appetite for customs union modernization at this stage?
Well, I think there is a huge push for it to happen. But again, I think there are political obstacles for it to do so. Now, let me explain. There is a big push. It's both in Europe's interest and Turkey's interest as well, right, at the moment, to talk seriously about customs union modernization. I mean, 40% of Turkish exports go to EU. Turkey is the fifth largest trading partner of the European Union. And Turkey is already very much embedded in the European industrial ecosystem. So, all of these are quite well known. And of course, this is also a time when the EU itself is, expanding its trade portfolio. It's just signed a free trade agreement with India. It's negotiating one with, Australia, it's Indonesia. So it's kind of going global when it comes to its trading regime, which of course raises important concerns in Turkey about how all of this will impact Turkey, given and in the case of a non-modernized customs union agreement. Now, on top of these, there's another problem that extends beyond the customs union, and that is the EU's new initiatives in industrial policy, such as the Industrial Accelerator Act, such as the Net Zero Industry Act, and there are others like this as well. Now, if you look at these initiatives, the focus is mainly keeping preference to Europe, right, and European producers. So there's a very clear tendency to prefer European producers, and think of it like SAFE, but expanded into every single industry that operates within Europe, right? And of course, this is a major risk for Turkey because it puts Turkish industries at a significant disadvantage. Now, of course, there are possibilities for, companies and candidate states like Turkey to be able to, make use of these funds and take a place actually and, be less marginalized. But then again, we still have to see whether or not this will be applied in practice and how implementation will be, or whether there will be the similar political roadblocks that exist there in the case of security and defense. And these are clear problems with Turkey. So I think it goes to show that customs union modernization is absolutely necessary in a way in which it's expanded to cover services and agriculture, but also a very well structured and working dispute settlement mechanism. That's all said and done, because that is a key, I would say, issue for Turkey, where all these, third countries that now has free trade agreements with the EU, they're going to gain tariff-free access also to Turkey. But as you know very well, that it's not going to be reciprocated. So it's not going to work the other way around. And if once you sign these agreements with countries like India, for instance, or China, those faraway lands, where Turkey runs a trade surplus and asymmetry with already, it becomes an even bigger problem. So customs union modernization is absolutely necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient anymore just to update and just to modernize the customs union, given that the EU is now on the road to a much more industry-oriented, security-oriented union. I think we need to be having a conversation about a renewed kind of bilateral framework where we include also how Turkey will attain or a certain degree of regulatory alignment with Europe so that it will be part of these strategies, or how, basically a dialogue to establish a more structured partnership and cooperation that covers not just a modernized customs union, but also mechanisms and roadmaps through which Turkey would also be a part of these new industrial mechanisms. I think this is absolutely necessary. Also for Europe, because it's going to be expand its industrial base by expanding to Turkey. And so it's not going to risk, again, further fragmentation. The fragmentation of integrated value chains is also a risk here, for Europe too. So I think this conversation needs to be had, but I'm not sure whether the political push, I think, on the Turkish side is there. I see a concerted effort, for instance, regarding the Made in Europe initiative. But of course, this needs to be reciprocated by the European side as well. And, there seems to be some effort, at least, more so than in the security and defense field, as, the issues are less thorny in this field than those. So one could be a little hopeful, but still we have to wait and see how it works out in practice.
Thank you, Senem, for drawing attention in particular to the trade aspect. And yes, you're right to note that the EU has been trying to diversify its trade partners with agreements with India, Mercosur, and yes, as of this morning of recording, Australia now, there's an agreement that's been reached. And so, Galip, I'd like to come to you on this. How is the EU's trade diversification drive affecting Turkey? Do you think this could be a key area of contention for the Turks?
No, absolutely. I mentioned the three issues that very much will define the future of Turkey-European relationship. One of them was whether they will become partner or rival in their shared neighborhood. Second is how they perceive, read, and adjust to the new global restructurings, great power at the time of the great power competition. And also the third one is to what extent the Turkey's economy will remain anchored within the European economic ecosystem. That includes also the Turkish place in the supply chains. That includes also the Turkish place in the redesign of this global connectivity, the trade connectivity between Europe and Indian Ocean and between Europe and China. So therefore, when Europe engages in all these economic deals with the different parts of the world, be it Australia to India to Mercosur or to anywhere else, the calculation in Ankara would be whether this new arrangement is undermining the Turkish economy or whether it's benefiting it. So if the perception is that these deals are undermining Turkey's economy, it's actually creating a condition of disadvantage for Turkey. That will create more and more question about the future of the ongoing custom union, because the custom union, unless it is modernized or updated in its current form, it will be increasingly unsustainable going forward. It's in dire need of updating. Thus far, there has been all this talk about the need for it, both at the European and Turkish level as well. But when it comes to implementation, we are far from it. So going forward, one of the major points would be for Turkey, how, and also the same goes for Europe, how the Turkish economy will remain anchored within the European economic ecosystem, because that will have a qualitative impact on the future of Turkey-European relations.
Thank you, Galip. If we take a step back, do you see the EU-Türkiye relationship remaining something more transactional or interest-based? Just to put this to both of you, do you think there is a pathway to a more constructive relationship, or will it be something more between this transactional relationship and between a more constructive partnership? Galip, could I perhaps come to you first?
Well, those are not mutually exclusive. It will be transaction in certain areas. It will be more institutionalized and structural and constructive in other areas. What is clear, it's not only about Turkey-European relationship. I think the question is the Europe's relationship with other European countries, from the UK to Norway to the South Caucasus one to Western Balkans one. Going forward, the one-size-fits-all approach probably will not work in terms of the European dealing with the countries and actors that are not member of the EU. So therefore, there is a dire need for Turkey and EU to come up with some form of a working framework for their relationship. Clearly, the membership framework doesn't work because both sides knows that it doesn't work. And the membership framework, rather than being an opportunity or an asset for an closer and better Turkey-EU relationship, actually it is more and more turning into an hindrance. So we need something, a new framework of relationship that is not just transactional, because the Turkey-EU relationship cannot be just merely transactional, cannot be just devoid of norms and rules and transformative aspect, because the Turkey and EU for each other, they're not foreign policy for each other, they're domestic politics for each other. So whatever happens in Europe will have a dramatic impact on Turkey. Whatever happens in Turkey will have a dramatic impact on Europe. So therefore, a new form of relationship, that is conscious that the membership framework is not working and probably will not work for anytime soon. So we need some different form of framework for the both relationship. And also that recognize the fact that just mere transactional migration deal type of relationship is also not good for the relationship. So you need something beyond it. But what I say, the global restructurings is creating a systemic factor, a systemic pressure on both sides to get closer and to find a way to chart the next phase of the relationship. So in a sense, the world getting rogue, put it that way, is a factor that the both sides has to take into account, and it's a factor that probably pushes them together. And that has been historically the case as well. So whenever there was like big global systemic transformation, that has had a qualitative impact on Turkey-European relationship in 19th centuries to the 20th centuries and now to 21st centuries. And in this regard, I see the relationship actually getting redefined.
Thank you, Galip. And how are you, Senem? Are you broadly optimistic or pessimistic here?
I don't know. I'm in between, I think. I mean, I generally agree with Galip in the sense that I think time has shown us that a pure transactional relationship between the two sides don't work. And this has been a modus vivendi more since around 2016 or so, dating back to the migration agreement. And so up to this day, it looked as if this was the way to go. So, just very limited cooperation on, one or two key areas of existential security or threat or fear for the EU. It doesn't work that way. First of all, once you start operating in that kind of mode, you lose your vision and you sort of just zoom in onto that. And it becomes very difficult for you to envision a different type of relationship or a broader one with this country that has been so micro policy oriented for the past decade. And so I don't think it's worked well with Turkey. I don't think it's worked very well for Europe. And I think this is the time when, accession is fine, it's there, right? It's frozen, but there's the possibility of it can also be revitalized in case things change. But regardless of the presence of the accession track, the two sides, given the urgency and also the disorder that we're going through, have to consolidate the institutional and structural relationship at a different level that covers not just economy, but also industry, if possible, security and defense to some extent, right? Which is largely through NATO anyway, migration, climate, CBAM, all of it. And in doing so, I think the key variable there, which is a problem not just for Turkey, but generally third countries that do business with the European Union and that are subject to EU policies, is that they're completely out of the decision-making system. And they're often not treated as equal partners when it comes to working with EU, which is understandable to a certain extent, because on the one hand, you're dealing with a massive size, the huge sort of unit of member states. But nonetheless, this makes it very difficult for third countries to engage in structured cooperation, knowing that, decisions will be imposed rather than made with them. And so I think that would also have to change to some extent if the EU wants to think about forms of meaningful differentiated cooperation, not just with Turkey, but also, countries in the Western Balkans, whose basically enlargement prospects are now really stalled, except perhaps with the exception of Montenegro, I don't know, or with Ukraine or possibly Georgia and Moldova, once and if the war is over, and, about membership and the fact that, how's it going to happen in a short period of time, or whether it's going to take a long period, then how's that that going to work out without losing these countries on the way towards accession? And I think this is a major problem that the EU has to grapple with. And I think the Turkish case, or dealing or thinking about how to rebuild the relations with Turkey, could set an example, perhaps, if we have to think optimistically in that framework as well.
Thank you very much, Senem. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but I'm very grateful to my guests. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining today. And thank you very much to our listeners for listening to the Unpacking Europe podcast. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the Centre for European Reform podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much.